All right, so I'm very happy to have Renee Stulz presenting why did small business fintech lending dry up during the COVID-19 crisis. So you have 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us present this paper. We look forward to the feedback. And it's with Zaid Ben David, a colleague of mine, and Mark Johnson, a former PhD student of both of us. So we talked about PPP. PPP is what comes after March 2020. And so the focus of the paper is on March 2020 before PPP shows up. Now, there's been lots of discussion of FinTech. Strengths of FinTech has been to improve access to credit. And that strength was quite visible before the COVID crisis. When I talk about the COVID crisis, I will mean March 2020. And what we address in the paper is whether FinTech kept performing that role during the COVID crisis. We'll show that the answer is no, and we'll focus on explaining why. We use data that is pretty unique. We have data from a FinTech lending marketplace with many online lenders. We have all the loan applications. We have all the offers made in response to the applications. And we have all the equilibrium outcomes. So we can look at demand, we can look at supply separately. What do we find? We find that the number of funded loans decreases dramatically during March 2020. The demand increases a lot. The demand is just about doubles. And the demand is higher quality than previously. But the supply drops. And so early March, an applicant had a probability of 54.2% of getting an offer. At the end of March, it's down to 13.2%. So essentially, the supply dries up. And we argue that the explanation for the drop is mainly that the lenders become financially constrained. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the platform. I will talk about the difference in funding between FinTech and bank lending. I will show the evolution of funded loans. I will focus on the demand and then the supply. And then I will end with some evidence from public firms. Most of the lenders are private, and so it's difficult to get data on them, but some of them are public. Then I will conclude. So the platform has more than 30 small business online lenders before COVID. They are mostly private companies. Their capital and the funds for loans come from VC, PE, bank debt, securitizations, or bonds. They don't have deposit funding. Okay, none of them are banks. None of them have deposit fundings. The market that we're looking at is one with unsecured loans. They are typically short terms, and they are relatively expensive. Okay, and so it's pretty close to subprime funding for small businesses. The platform functions as follows. It receives the applications. Then it distributes the applications to suitable lenders. All the lenders have various criteria that they may make known to the platform for the type of loans they will consider. Within hours, you will get offers, and the loans are going to be funded within 1 or 3 days. So it's an extremely efficient process. We have 6,550 completed applications in March 2020. The average loan amount is $59,000, and the average APR is 80%. When you think of FinTech funding as opposed to banks, now banks work very differently during a crisis. This, on the left, you have the deposits during March, being just an incredible amount of deposits showing up on bank balance sheets. And so banks then get the funds that allows them to make loans if they want to make loans. The FinTech don't have that. No, they don't have this rushing in of funding for loans. So here we have the loan volume. We look at 5 business day averages. And you can see that in March, there is a pretty dramatic drop from high volume to just about nothing On this, it's the amount funded, and you see the same thing. Okay, so essentially the funding, the lending dries up. Okay. So you might say, well, is this unique to the platform, or did this occur elsewhere for fintech lending? We obtained data for the loans made for the personal loans, unsecured personal loans made by through fintech. We only have the loans that were made, so we can't look separately at demand and supply. But you can see that the same is happening with the personal loans. They decrease pretty sharply. So we think that what we are talking about with our platform is something that took place more generally. There is also data from S&P that is consistent with what we talk about. So let's look at the demand. Here we have the number of applications on the left, the financing side on the right, and you can see that there is a dramatic increase about the second week of March, now when it started to become clear that things were going to get really problematic. So you see a big increase, and then you see that when the stimulus seems to come close, it drops, and then now if you remember, the Senate blocked the stimulus, and immediately the demand for loans went back up. Towards the end, once the stimulus is signed, the demand becomes much lower because people are looking at possibly receiving PPP. We look at whether the COVID severity affects the demand. And so on the left, we distinguish between states that have statewide lockdown versus other states. So the restrictive states are the blue ones, the less restrictive states are the red ones. And you can see that that doesn't seem to make that much of a difference, except for a very brief period of time here. We also look across industries, and the evolution seems to be pretty similar across industries as well. So when we look at whether the quality of the applicants changes, now you could see the supply falling simply because the applicants have become lousy. And that's not what's going on. Obviously, the concern is the data we have on the applicants is in some sense historical data. Now it doesn't reflect what is going to happen to those applicants under COVID. It reflects their status before COVID. But you can see that between March 2019 and March 2020, the FICO score actually increases, is better. You can see that they have higher annual sales. Now, I mean, it's interesting to compare this with the first paper we heard today. The first paper talked about really small firms, but ours are actually a bit smaller than that. But so the quality doesn't go down, and within March, the quality increases as well. Now, the FICO score is higher in the second half of March than it is in the first half of March. So there's some self-selection going on the demand side with better applicants wanting loans. So the demand nearly doubles from pre-crisis levels. The application increase does not seem to be driven by harder hit areas or sectors. It seems to be across the board. And the applicants appear to be higher quality. So when you look at this, now obviously the demand can't be the explanation for the drying up of the volume of loans. So we have to look at the supply, which is what we do next. So now the way for us to think about the supply a useful way to think about it is just the probability that if you apply, you are going to receive an offer. Now, we are also going to look at the terms of the offers, but for a start, we look at the probability of receiving an offer. And prior to March 2020, it was 58%. Now, you might receive an offer and you don't like it, but that was the probability of receiving an offer. Now, so it's a good measure of the supply, and it's kind of unusual that you can look separately at the demand on the supply without actually having to do any econometrics. And so what we do next now is we look at applicant characteristics and look at whether the date of the implication is related to the probability of receiving an offer. So what we find, controlling for applicant characteristics, is that the offer likelihood decreases by 41 percentage points. Now that's a huge decrease. We then ask whether this reduction is related to the local economic shock. Okay, and so this is the second paper today that uses safe graph data, and I don't have to explain it at this point. No, so we use the cell phone data as a measure of the reduction in mobility within areas. And we have time on county fixed effects in addition to that. Okay, and so I don't want to go through all of this, but what we have is a regression of whether an offer is received on characteristics of the borrowers. Now, so those are the controls. We have industry fixed effects. We cluster by application date. And what you can see is these are indicator variables for each week of March. So it's a measure of kind of the change in the probability of receiving an offer that is unrelated to the characteristics of the applicants. And you can see that it decreases monotonically and becomes very large.
René,
no?
Just a clarification.
Yeah.
You do this in probability, but is the total amount being supplied the same? Because there are more applicants, right? So I'm wondering whether I'm just competing with more people, and that's a mechanical effect, or there is more into this? Can you?
Well, there's more into it. So that's a good question, and I'm not sure how we would handle it. It's certainly for these 2 weeks, the demand has fallen already, so it couldn't explain it. The overall volume falls as well, no? So the total amount drops as well. So in that sense, it's not mechanical. But we should think about a way to kind of show this that maybe better. Yeah.
Yes, here you're showing us the match between the applicant that gets the.
Right.
However, COVID has an heterogeneous effect throughout the economy.
Right.
So if
We
you
get to that. We get to that. Okay. So, yeah. Sorry, I should have said that the next step is to look at now kind of the pandemic on how it varies across regions on industry. Okay. And so here now we look at how a state lockdown affects the supply, how the percentage of population that is at home. Now it increases dramatically during March, at least in some places. So we do this at the state level, and we have an average. Okay, and so let's focus on this one here. What is surprising is in some sense the effects of the impact of COVID are bigger than they seem to be. Okay, so a state lockdown reduces the supply, reduces the probability of an offer. But for the percent of population home, we don't have a significant effect. Okay, and the effect for the state lockdown is quite small. Okay, because remember, that the overall decrease in the supply is 40 percentage points, and this is a tenth of that. Okay? So,
You have just over 5 minutes.
oh, okay. Well, wait a minute. Well, yeah, you're right. But I get an extra minute for the same first name. Okay, so we find some evidence that regional shocks account for some of the reduction in supply, but it explains very little of these weekly coefficients. Okay, now it could still be related to risks that doesn't vary across regions, just aggregate uncertainty, and perhaps the difficulty of assessing risk. Okay, so if that was the case, you would see the offer terms change. And what is really surprising is the offer terms really don't change during the month of March. Okay, there is almost no change. We look at load size, we look at maturity, we look at APR. Now, if it's uncertainty, you would expect smaller loans, shorter maturity, and higher APR. We don't find that. Okay, and you can see this here. Now, essentially, you have no stars. Now, which means that those things don't really change. Now we have APR, maturity, and loan amount. And the same when we look at the state on the impact of COVID on the state. So COVID doesn't seem to explain the change in loan terms. That's very hard to explain through changes in uncertainty of making loans. Now it has to come from somewhere else. So why did supply fall? We look at two hypotheses. One is uncertainty. Now it becomes more risky, and so loans are less likely to be made. Or a financial constraints hypothesis, which is that the lenders don't have the money to make loans. Okay, and the bottom line is we find what we believe is strong support for the financial constraint hypothesis. With the uncertainty hypothesis, you would expect changes in terms. You would expect that hypothesis to work at the individual loan level, and we don't see that happening. So let's talk about the financial constraints hypothesis. Well, the lenders, now their net worth falls because their existing loans lose in value, and in addition, they can't raise funds for new loans. No, so that's what is going on. As a result, they can't make loans. So what are the predictions? Well, if liquidity dries up or capital becomes deficient, you expect the lenders to drop out. No, you just expect them to quit. You don't expect them to change the terms of the loans because they don't have to make the money to make the loans. Okay, and so that's what we observe for a lot of the lenders. Now they keep making loans and suddenly they stop. Okay, so that's a pattern across the lenders that we have. You can see here the number of active lenders. It goes from above 30 to almost 0 during the month of March. So the pattern is lenders keep making loans until they drop out. Now, the lenders differ in the riskiness of the loans that they make. And so you would expect the lenders that make riskier loans to be the first one to drop out, because those loans, their existing loans, are going to lose value the fastest, and the new loans are going to be the riskiest. And that's the pattern that we see. Okay, for what we see is that the lenders that drop out first are the ones where kind of the median FICO score is lower than the ones who drop out later. Now, which is consistent with predictions of financial constraints. I have
over 1 minute.
1 minute, yes. So maybe I will stop with this. Now, as a way to test this, we use this design from Kwajalein and Mian, where we look at within borrowers changes in the probability of getting loans. Now, what you would expect is that an applicant is more likely to get a loan from a riskier lender than a safer lender. No, because the riskier lenders, the ones that make riskier loans, are more likely to say yes. And we find that pattern before the crisis. We don't find it within the crisis, now, which is consistent with financial constraints. And I'm not going to show that. One last piece of support for the financial constraints is one of the firms has a securitization program where you can see the price of the loans. That's the evolution of the B note for Cabbage, which is one of the lenders. Now it goes from 100 to just about 0 back up. Now, which obviously when you are here, it's pretty difficult to raise funds through securitization. Okay, I think I'm going to, I have to stop.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. I wish I were there. I intended to be there, and I'm very sad to not be there. I sadly got COVID for the first time 5 days ago. And so when I look back on COVID, I'm going to remember all these Renees talking at me at my delirium, right? But yeah, so thanks for putting up with me on Zoom. So I'm at Treasury now on leave from Berkeley. And so the usual disclaimer here that these views are mine alone, do not represent the policies or opinions of Treasury or the US government. I'm at Treasury, my portfolio is coordinating climate finance in domestic finance, as well as the small business pieces that we do in programs and bits of the PPP and some other small business programs that we have, the SSBCI. So relevant stuff I've been doing for the last year and a half or so. And so it's nice to be an academic today. I'm going to summarize, I'm not going to do a summary. I'm going to go right into comments, and the summary will come out of that. And actually, I'm going to focus on the part that Renee did not get to, so it's a good complement to what he shared. I think there's the high value add of the paper comes from that last piece. And so let me do that. The first thing I want to do is talk about banks, though. This story is about, ultimately, it's really the contribution here is really the capital structure behind the fintech lenders. And so that capital structure is what is, the authors argue that the capital structure matters for, resiliency of these lenders to be able to provide loans in volatile times, right? That's the main punchline. That's the thing we don't know. That's the thing we haven't thought about. And so that's really the piece I would argue that the authors focus on a bit more. So let me just, I really only have 2 comments, but lots of slides with those 2 comments. So the first comment is the word bank. The word bank, I really think the paper has nothing to do with the word bank. And the reason, I have a couple of reasons, but I think the word in some sense should not even be in the paper. The first part of the reason is that the bank is not at all the counterfactual here, right? If you look at this is some made up distribution of small business lending. You've got low interest products, which are the SBA stuff, Main Street Bank, which especially the regional banks or other smaller banks offering low interest rate loans. Then medium, where some of the fintech products are in that. Credit cards. We know from the Fed story that the Fed study that everyone cites is something like 83% of small businesses borrow from credit cards, either personal or company ones. And there's a more recent SBA study that's 45%, but still, the point is the counterfactual here, and then the high risk one is fintech products and other kind of distress loans. The counterfactual has nothing to do with banks. It's two different markets. Pushing on that, if you're looking for what the counterfactual is to what we have here, you have to stare at this sort of graph and be like, wow, where are we going? And in some sense, the big play is maybe not so much yet in the US, but in other contexts, the e-commerce, but certainly the payment providers, Square, Stripe, those type of organizations have moved deeply into credit. They have natural information on revenues that allows them some advantage. So just thinking through, I mean, there's a lot on this page I'm not going to talk about, but there's thinking through where the counterfactual is, and here's some basic numbers on the size of the originations. You see that was not my highlighting. The PayPal and Square being up here and so forth. And so I think taking what the authors have done and casting where we're going in the landscape of small business would be really useful, but in telling that capital structure story related to what I'm showing you here and that prior slide. So that's my first point. The second part about banks is the quote that the authors say here, that the decrease in loan supply to small business is unique to fintech and not equivalent for banks. I just don't think that's right. And so this is the quote from the paper, and that there's the footnote. Footnote 5 takes you to this paper, which shows by different size of banks. So you see the orange are the smaller banks, and this going up is the PPP. But this going up for the larger banks is pulling down lines of credit. So the question is, what are the smaller banks who are providing more of the small business lending doing? And so we can follow again for another footnote 5 from this page, from this paper, to which pulls other papers. And basically all of that uptick in small business lending is pulling down a line of credits, which the smallest small businesses, which are the ones studied here, they don't have, right? And so we can follow one more paper, and here we have the line of credit evidence from this paper, and you see that there is an uptick in the pulling down the line of credit, so uptick in loans to businesses, but it's not in the smallest of the businesses. So this is there's an A, B, there's a C and D of larger and larger businesses, but you see there's nothing going on in the smallest businesses in terms of increasing loans with that need in March of 2020. So just pushing back on that piece, the small businesses, the small ones are not getting an uptick. So that's just a side that I think that bank comparison is a little bit off. And finally, this interpretation about the investors pulling back, which is really the thing that's super interesting here. If we start talking about secured bank lending versus unsecured, riskier lending, it's just apples and oranges. And so, I think I would restrict my thinking in terms of going after that within fintech, and then drawing the implication for the overall capital structure of some of these other things that are comparative in the small business landscape. So that's comment 1 here. Just motivating where you're headed. This is giving you some flavor. I hope you can see this. Okay, it's kind of small. Some of the lenders, the fintechs, and who are their target audience, and the strategies on who they're going after and where they think their niche is, really motivating what the authors here are going after. Is like, even among the fintechs, there's differences in risk, and we're going to use that to understand the supply effect. Okay, so I think this is an important thing to understand, that fintech is not one beast at all. Even within this sector, which are the more just fintech funds, as opposed to like the payment providers or e-commerce, even that, there's a lot of different strategies going on here. All right, so my comment 2 is about going right to that uncertainty versus financing constraints. And what could drive fintechs pulling back from loans. So the story the authors are telling is there are loans out there that might be profitable. There are applications out there that offer an opportunity for loans for a lender that might be profitable, but some lenders are unwilling to go there in March 2020, and the argument is their capital structure is not giving them funding. Okay, and so these things I have on the slide come from the introduction in the paper. That what is the uncertainty channel? A lot of these pieces of the uncertainty channel, except for this number one, are making comparisons that are, again, not apples for apples, right? The collateral piece or the data models, right? I think those are, not the real punchline. So, but the real punchline are the ones I have with my bad circling here, about the opportunities are becoming riskier. And so an applicant shows up, you look at their credit score, you look at their profiles, that doesn't speak to what's going on in March 2020, right? So that historical information is really not reflective of the risk. And so the fintechs are pulling back, and they're pulling back differentially by risk, because the difference in what the application looks like and the reality on the ground for those small businesses differs by riskiness of the fintech, right? That's the uncertainty piece. The financing piece is that, fintechs have some skin in the game, and they have balance sheet exposure to cash flows, even if they've sold off most, which they have, but often they still have a piece where they have a reputation related to that piece. But the other balance sheet piece that's not really mentioned is, I think it is mentioned, but it's not emphasized, is the refinance channel. I was working in the state of California on a small business product for the state in 2020 during this time in March. And the reality is a lot of the lenders were thinking about the need for refi on their existing balance sheet, on their existing customers, and using their funding to support the existing loans so they don't go into default, right, is something they had in mind. So there's that piece.
You have about 4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay, there's that piece as well. And so this disentangling is really the key here. So on that, some suggestions, okay. So external margin suggestions. So here's the evidence that Renee presented about that some lenders just stop lending at all. So here a couple of notes, here's a quote from the CEO of Adair, that there's no model I can predict today if I lend $1, I'll get it back. So understanding more on this full pullback, I would suggest the authors do more. This picture's not as obvious to me as one might want, but I think it's central to the paper. So just some suggestions on do more here, right? We need to understand this dropping out altogether and why the CEO quote is not relevant for all of the fintech, right? The internal margin. So this is my favorite part of the paper is table 7. Table 7 is this within Kwajalein estimation. And what it says is that the lenders with the highest risk tolerance are more likely to make an offer. That's just normal stuff. But this differential goes away in the post period. So in other words, the sum of negative 0.22 and the positive 0.20 equals 0. So there's no longer a differential in the median FICO is not the borrower, it's the lender attribute of what they've done in the past. And so the strategy of taking more applications, it hits most for the higher risky. That is the punchline. I made a couple of pictures on this. So what we see is the red is the pre-period, and I just made up this picture, but it's very reflective of the estimation. Is that you take more offers, right? The lender makes more offers if it's a higher risky lender. That's fine, but in the post period, that trend goes away. right? And notice that a lot of these have dropped out. The red dots have dropped out. This is the same dot as this. It's just in the post period. It's a flattened pattern, right? And so that's the story there. My instinct here is that there's, that a lot of the story is about the balance sheet and the cash flow problem and the appetite for risk varying in a way that is related to this refi and the other exposure. I'm not sure that's a capital structure story. And I really can't figure that piece out. And so my next couple slides are arguing for the authors to really take steps forward to help us understand whether this different story is all else equal. Some fintechs have a different investor pool that's pulling back in a differential way. That really does matter. And so I think I've written a lot of words here, so hopefully these slides will make more sense than maybe I'm doing here in the rush. So
You have 1 minute, Adair.
okay, a couple of points. I'm going to skip this. This is another piece. This is my last slide. So what would I do? I would really focus on this internal margin piece as well as the external, but on this table 7 and dig more. So here's some suggestions on this. I don't have time to cover everything, but are there applicant characteristics that interacted with the lender strategy that help us understand whether it's the strategy, whether it's the exposure to restaurants, the exposure to different geographies, what is it about these particular lenders that face more, what you would argue, more constraints in funding? Is it also related to the strategy of who they're targeting? And how can we really disentangle that? Because to me, the punchline here is capital structure behind the funding mechanism in here. And that story you tell too strongly in the paper at the moment, but it's important to tell it. So my arguments here, and I give some suggestions of different ways to dig into this on this slide, but my argument would be to really dig more and drop some of the demand stuff. It's fairly straightforward at this point, and really dig into going after the supply and can we disentangle more thoroughly. So let me stop there. And Renee, apologies, both Renees, apologies for not being able to dig into the econometrics and doing a little bit more. And for the authors, I'm happy to talk more on these things.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adair, and thanks especially for doing this despite COVID. We also wish you were here. So we're a little bit short of time, but can we not take a lot of time responding to the comments so that you have more opportunity for questions?
Maybe we can do the question before and then you respond to it.
Yeah, is that fine with you?
Is it okay if we ask additional questions and then you respond to everything?
You guys are in charge.
All right, so Paula is co-organizer, she calls the shots, but I do have to
Yeah, okay. So I have a question which is partly, I think, Adair has replied, and then in more general comment. So do we know or do you know whether these businesses that are, in some way we can call rejected from these loans, they also have an opportunity to apply to bank loans? Because, from the statistics that you showed, they had bank balances. And so the first question is this affecting just this type of business? And if yes, which is the direction it seems to be going, what is your opinion in terms of the bank balance, the bank versus fintech balance sheet? Is it that banks are in general more resilient, or is just because during COVID, deposits skyrocketed, and so in some way you're making a comparison between two types of intermediaries, but in some way banks had a huge advantage during this period just because we had all these government plans that increased savings?
A question on the how fast the recovery of the supply of funds, that might give you maybe some insight on why fintechs might be not so resilient in terms of providing funding. And again, to the point of the heterogeneity of these fintechs, so for example, Cabbage and Lending Club have different capital structures, and you might be able to tease out more out of that.
All right, okay, so I'm going to give you a very short amount of time to answer those questions.
Okay, thanks. I mean, Adair deserves a medal for doing this and doing it so well. I agree with a lot of stuff she said. I mean, now the reason we talk about banks is more about the different funding model. And they have a funding model that is more resilient. Now, in response, the firms, I mean, we don't have much data on the firms in our sample outside of their application, so we really don't know what they could do. But now the median FICO score is around 660, which banks don't lend to people below 660 generally. You know, they lend very little. So it's really two non-overlapping sets. In that, I mean, I agree with what Adair was saying, you know, that we are looking at a different universe. I still think it's fairly, I mean, it's interesting that the banks were resilient. I think we have some data that may be more positive on them keeping lending beyond drawing down credit lines. But it is a different universe. I agree with that. Doing more the way Adair suggests, you know, we are going to look at it, and I'm looking forward to getting the slides and thinking about it. There is a huge difficulty, which is that all those lenders are private. It's very hard to learn anything about them. Now the exceptions being Cabbage. Cabbage is one, but there are like two or three exceptions. We scoured the web extensively to try to learn about them, but we kind of feel that we're at the end of what we can learn. But so many thanks, and hope you feel better.